Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 29. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience for whom we are most grateful. Viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Gabriel Noronha. Gabriel is the Executive Director of Polaris National Security. He has advised Congress on national security policy and testified on sanctions policy to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He has previously served as Special Advisor for the State Department's Iran Action Group and Special Assistant for the Senate Armed Services Committee. He's also a fellow at JINSA's Center for Defense and Strategy. Gabriel, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in. As I mentioned, we always like to have our audience get to know who our guests are as people before they jump in as policy experts. So we usually say, hey, when you were in elementary school and they said, what do you want to do when you grow up? I'm guessing it wasn't working for Polaris since it wasn't established then. So why don't you talk a little bit about what brought you into this national security conversation and dealing with issues like China, Russia, Middle East generally?
Well, I'm from New Hampshire, the Granite State, which just had its primary yesterday. We're recording on Wednesday. And we've always had lots of presidential candidates come through. I brought all sorts of people to my high school, saw everyone from Hillary Clinton to Ron Paul at my, in my classes or just next door. And so always had that interest in politics. I think I was on the couch after my wisdom teeth got pulled out, scrolling through TV channels and came upon C-SPAN and realized, hey, this stuff's pretty interesting. So it might have been the Vicodin, or it might have been the politics bug that got me. But always just been fascinated by not just sort of the policy, but the process of how does government make the things happen. I was actually a runner. I ran Division I in college, went to the University of Virginia. And when I started, I was thinking, how can I wanted to be I was going to be a biochemist back in the day, and said, well, let me take Chinese on a whim because it fits in my schedule, and this seems like an interesting thing to learn. And I dabbled in international relations. Well, after long, I realized I had no interest in sitting in a basement lab somewhere for hours a day. I wanted to be in the fight. I wanted to work with people, and I think that's what politics really is it's how do humans live together? How do they find these things that work? And so ultimately, I added Russian on top of my Chinese language. I was a sucker for punishment, and can't say I had the most flourishing social life in college. And then came to DC after that.
I'll talk a little bit about what your Chinese language learning experience was. I mean, when I was in college, I signed up for a Japanese class, and it was just a foreign exchange student said, hey, I am from Japan, but I was born in Taiwan. I'd rather you learn Chinese. So I said, well, I haven't even started yet. So I jumped into Chinese. And as they say, the rest was history. But what was your experience like jumping into Chinese?
If I had known what I was signing myself up for, I probably would have gone with Italian. It was, and for those who haven't studied Mandarin, it is one of the hardest languages out there. It was 3 hours a day, every single day of memorizing these characters, writing all these things on note cards and staring at them every morning, every night. And then, what really changed for me and what drove my interest was I studied in Taiwan after my freshman year. I landed knowing no one and nothing and having no program that I was joining, just flew to the island. And did a great 3-month program at the National Taiwan Normal University. They have a Mandarin training center for anyone who is ever thinking about escaping their life here and going. Highly recommend it. It's in Taipei. And Taiwan is, an incredible place. It is, to me, the best of everything in Chinese culture. and if you see, it's one of those, the road diverges. One path goes to communism, one path goes into democracy and open society, and you see the difference. And it's really something spectacular. And so was there for a full summer. I wish I could go back all the time. And then continued on with my studies and interned way back in the day at the American Enterprise Institute on their Asia team before I got to the Senate.
When was that?
This was, now I'm aging myself, over a decade ago. First going to AEI, and stayed there, and then my experience at think tanks it was great learning the policy, and I said, what I really want to do now is I want to implement this.
Yeah.
And that's what drove me ultimately to go to the U.S. Senate after that. There's a part of me that has that bug that just wants to be an Asia studies guy and dive in. You can be a linguist and all you can do is work on the Chinese language. It is this beautiful, complex thing that is an enigma wrapped in a riddle sometimes. But the more you do it, the more you love that language. It's almost like a math puzzle.
Well, oddly for me, I was very, very bad at Latin-based languages because I was kind of a mathematics person and a logic person, and I would overthink the conjugations. And for me, it was beautiful simplicity of Chinese. There's no plurality, there's no gender, there's no tense. You just talk about action completed or not, and very descriptive. So for whatever was going on in my brain, it was sort of just fish in water time, and off it went. I could get good grades in Spanish, but my friend whose family was from Guatemala, I couldn't understand a lick of what they were saying when they were getting together for family gatherings. They tried, they loved me, they tried, but for me, it was survival in Taiwan, learning what you're eating and getting home safely. When your physical safety is at stake, there's something that clicks in, and language acquisition, I think, moves into another gear. But so you did some of the language thing. You went to Fantasy Island, Taiwan, where all your dreams come true. And you come back to the United States, you have politics and policy bug. You go to the Senate. Now, some people around town, with all due respect to those who are in the body of 100, don't seem to find that to be the fastest paced body that is in DC. But what were some of your key takeaways from your time up on the Hill and in the Senate?
Well, the Senate, for those who haven't been in DC a lot, is very much views itself as the only thing in the world that matters. George H.W. Bush used to say that the Senate is the country club and the House is chicken poop, shall we say. It's a much more slower deliberative body, which is good because there's some ideas that come to us a little half-baked from the House. Sometimes things come over there a little political. Sometimes the idea just hasn't been thought through. Now, the problem is also sometimes that means the Senate just doesn't do anything on a subject. You look at entitlement reform, you look at healthcare. The Republicans have, basically anytime one party has 60 votes, which has really only happened once in my lifetime, which was the first year of the Obama presidency, that's really been the only time that people have been able to pass legislation unilaterally through them. Now there's been this sort of newfound element, which is reconciliation, which allows you to push massive spending bills through Congress. But before then, it was, you really have to get a bunch of people in a room who disagree with each other and say, what can we agree on that gets put in this bill?
Yeah.
And it's not easy, but I have to say it's a lot more fulfilling when you actually do get success there.
Mm-hmm. Well, you went from that super fun adventure, if my timing is right, you then also got some experience in the State Department. Now, as someone who has served in government, I decidedly did not spend time in the State Department. It was another one of those things where you sort of felt like where ideas and presidential policies went to hit the brick wall. Now, there were some exceptions in the last presidential term where some real policies, some actual big policies actually did go in and come out the other end. Everything from the Abraham Accords to some really changes in direction, tone, and substance on China. And you could go down the list. But why don't you talk a little bit about what your experience was at Foggy Bottom?
I probably didn't also know what I was getting myself into when I went to the State Department. I'd been warned that the sort of the career folks are, one, some of the smartest people in government, which they absolutely are, but also that they have a little bit of a mind and a will of themselves, which they also most certainly do, which makes it an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is if you can prove and convince the career people that what you're doing is a really worthy task and needs to be done, you can bring people on board who will fight with you and work till 9 or 10 p.m. on something if they really believe in it. And if it's something that they fervently disagree with, it's going to be a really tough time getting it through the building. Mm-hmm. And so this was a challenge that I think a lot of people who are new to government struggle with. And ultimately, my view was, look, I believe that the ideas we're pushing on Iran in this case, and then certainly on our China team, were things that made sense, and that if you thought them through, you could really convince a lot of people that we could advance U.S. power, we could change the world, we could change the Middle East for the better, we could change our relationship with China and reset that relationship for the better. And it took a lot of hard work, but we, I think, convinced not only the U.S. government, but I think we convinced a broad swath of the U.S. public as well that the way we had conducted business didn't make sense, and we needed a radical reshift. One thing that I thought was important is we did a really interesting public relations campaign on both China and Iran. On China, we had the top cabinet officials, the Attorney General, the Secretary of Defense, State, National Security Advisor, CIA Director, all give keynote addresses. This is mostly 2019 and 2020 on really in-depth policy areas about the U.S.-China relationship, really trying to make the intellectual case of why we needed to change, why we needed to reset, and ultimately sort of the threat from China. This was actually put into a compendium that the State Department released. If anyone's listening, they should go check it out. It's a wealth of sort of intellectual knowledge and facts and statistics of everything that could get declassified out of the U.S. government. We did. I think it's a set of documents I think is going to live for a long time for people, for historians and others to study of how did the United States come to think that we need to reset this policy.
It's certainly a very important thing to do, and it's a work that's going to need to be continued. So let's pivot from that to where you currently work and talk a little bit about Polaris National Security, which I would just lead in with saying is an organization that is building public awareness for continuation of this changed approach to national security and foreign policy. But correct me if that quick summary is wrong. Talk a little bit about Polaris and kind of the key priorities, and then bring us back into the China desk parts of the Polaris portfolio.
Absolutely. So coming out of the administration, I was working closely with Morgan Ortagus, who is the spokesperson for Secretary Pompeo and President Trump. And we said, we've made a huge number of wins across the world. And the public doesn't always pay attention to foreign policy, so they don't always understand what's happened and why things happened. And we wanted to explain that to the American people. And we wanted to try to preserve the gains we had made, make sure we don't go backwards on others, and work, help the incoming administration succeed on things like the China challenge of how can we get this right together. China is too big an issue for Republicans or Democrats to fight about the entire time. It is an existential issue. And so at Polaris, we focus a lot on what keeps Americans safe. How can we continue to have U.S. leadership around the world and make sure that the next generation of Americans is as safe and as well positioned as we are today. One of our focuses is in the Middle East is how can we advance the Abraham Accords? How can we protect Israel and their right to survive? Obviously, the central challenge there is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and figuring out how we can put pressure back on that regime to weaken it and enable it, everyone else in the region to get back to peace.
Mm-hmm.
On China, a lot is about educating the public on the full scope of what the Chinese Communist Party is up to. Again, it's a whole society threat, from everything from the military to intelligence and surveillance, public health. We saw with COVID, obviously, but there continues to be concerning elements there. And then I think one of the central challenges is the economic competition and infiltration. We see this with the tech sector especially, but really across the wide spectrum. We're seeing the United States be at significant risk that the Chinese government is gaining leverage and control over the U.S. economy, our investing sectors, and also sort of the political element there too, of being able to control what we do or do not do on China policy.
Well, talk through a little bit of kind of what your priority action areas are. I know that Polaris has some events around the country driving the conversation and engages candidates and others that are in office to try to help them speak from a stronger platform on these things and give them things they can actually do. But talk a little bit about sort of the action areas you have on China.
Absolutely. So we do a lot of events with candidates. We take candidates to the southern border so they can see for themselves everything that's happening there, the law enforcement problem, actually learning that individuals come from all across the world. There are hundreds, if not thousands now of Chinese individuals coming across the border. Instead of going through San Francisco Airport, SFO, or Dulles, you can just go into Mexico and come up the border, and you don't need a visa, and you can still get in. Really changes the game there. And then we do educational briefings with candidates. So we have about an 80-page national security Bible that walks them through all elements of everything from, here is China's naval fleet in 2000 and where the United States naval fleet was. We had about 196 ships then. And then today we're at 193, I think. And China is way ahead of us and rising and rapidly. Sorry, 291 in 2000, and we're at 296 today. Whereas you look at the Chinese fleet, and they've massively, massively overtaken us, and they're on track to hit 400 ships by 2025. And so part of it is we do these we brief them on all the stats so that when they come to Congress, and if they're elected, they're going to be prepared on day one to address the national security challenges that are confronting our nation. A lot of members of Congress take a year, 2 years, 5 years to get up to speed on these things. And we think it's important that they get to Congress fully equipped there. One thing I've noticed is even if these candidates receive these briefings, most of them have no idea of the sheer scope of the problem that we're facing.
Yeah.
And these are some of the most informed people in our country. The American public, I think, really deserves to know the full scope of this. And if they did, I think they would realize we're in for a battle.
Yeah, no, I think that one of the fundamental theses that are out there today is that we've had people debating whether or not a Cold War is okay and maybe we should avoid one, but that kind of ignores the reality that one's already been declared on us for some time. And we really only have the choice of whether and how to respond. And it sure seems to me in recent years, the COVID effect has been pretty significant. And our policy folk and political folk are catching up with where I think the grassroots has moved very strongly in the direction of something was done to us. We now know without any real doubt where it came from and that we weren't told the truth when it happened, and there needs to be some kind of accountability. But how? How do we have accountability on that? And on trade, I mean, China's economy is struggling, and people have known that we made a bad bet, and now we need to make a different approach to safe shoring and onshoring some of our manufacturing. We can't have these dependencies, but how do we go about doing that? And so, sort of what are our guiding principles for doing so? The Select Committee on strategic competition with the CCP and the House of Representatives has done a pretty good job of keeping that conversation bipartisan, something that sounds from your description of the Polaris work is a priority for yours as well. But we've got a lot of work to do to help give people the confidence that they're on the right track, that there are action steps they can take in the states. And when they come to the federal government in Congress or otherwise, there's things they can do. What are some of the kind of top policy things that you say just on a short list when you come in as a new member of Congress, or you come in a new member of the House or Senate, or you're someone who wants to be an advisor or an appointee in a future administration? Here's kind of the top 2 or 3 things you can really do to make a difference on a new direction on China.
I think any conversation on China that doesn't start with fentanyl is missing a big part of the picture. 110,000 Americans killed in 2021, and then another 110,000 killed in 2022, of which over about 75,000 is from fentanyl and opioids. And we know that most of those precursors are made in China. I actually went on, I think it's called madeinchina.com, which is an e-commerce site in China. And I went and I searched for fentanyl precursors, and I found them on these websites. And they say we offer discreet shipping to Indiana, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Mexico, Prague, wherever you want it, we will get it there. And they have screenshots showing successful purchases here. This is, hundreds of Americans dying every day. And this is, to me, something that is, a proper foreign policy. President Biden has said it's a foreign policy for the middle class. I don't really agree with that. I think a foreign policy really has to look at how are we helping Americans here at home. Fentanyl, getting that epidemic under control, stopping the precursors coming from China has to be really at the top of the list. The second one is
no pushback from us on that. I mean, I lost my daughter in October to fentanyl poisoning here in Florida. And everywhere I go, there are families who have gone through the exact same thing. And I agree completely that makes a very good starting point because it is real. It's not theoretical. This is an attack that's already happening in our communities. And so it's not just, are we gathering forces to deter an attack on Taiwan, which is another topic. But yeah, I agree completely. We begin with something that's happening here. It's bigger and it's more vicious than COVID was.
You're right. Yeah. And it's continuing on. And not to downplay COVID by any means, but right. Fentanyl kills the youngest amongst us usually. It's usually people in their prime of their life.
All races, all economic backgrounds.
It doesn't discriminate. Yeah. And then I think you nailed the number 2 one is really not only how do we prevent a war over Taiwan, but if it comes down to it, how do we win it? Mm-hmm. The unclassified war games show that 10,000 American sailors may die in the first week of the war. What troubles me a lot is also that we know that we run out of long-range munitions about 10 days into that war, according to the open source estimates. That means 10 days in, we're fighting with a hand tied behind our back. And so if we don't get the munitions supply chain right now, we are, again, every month that we're missing out here is tens, hundreds, perhaps, American lives of our sons and daughters. And so, again, if we're fighting a war, let's say 5 years from now, most of that war will be fought with weapons that we have today. We can build new weapons, we can get things on the supply chain. But if we're paying for a new aircraft carrier today, that is not going to be ready in time for this war in 5 years. So how can we do a lot of this modernization yesterday? And then for the remaining items, how can we make sure that they go the furthest possible? And a lot of this all starts with defense spending. Mm-hmm. If we don't have the budget for the readiness of our troops, if we don't have the budget for the opening new weapons production lines, again, we're not at war today in the sense that we don't have missiles firing off in the East China Sea. But we're in a Cold War, whether we wanted it or not. We didn't ask for it. But the Chinese Communist Party has asked effectively. They wanted to reshape the order. And so I think those are the top 2 things that the next member of Congress, the next person coming into a new administration has to be thinking about day and night.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about some of the other portfolios that Polaris covers that kind of compete for attention and resources that would affect the very things that we were talking about in dealing with China. I mean, it's impossible to talk about the munitions supply chain and other things without acknowledging that we've had a significant outflow of resources for the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This isn't really a debate about the whether or not to help, but I think it's undeniable that we have sort of a finite set of what's available to us until we increase supply and change manufacturing. We have an unstable situation in the Middle East right now that could amplify. Hopefully it does not. But talk a little bit about the impact of some of these other portfolios in what we have to deal with China and whether action in these other areas materially affects, in your assessment, China's calculus.
When I took my economics courses, the first thing they tell you is economics is the study of how do we satisfy unlimited desires with limited means. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the perfect question when it comes to our munitions. We do not have unlimited weapons. We do not have unlimited missiles and warheads. But we do have, it seems today, almost unlimited threats to the United States and our interests abroad. One of the things Polaris works a lot on is the Middle East, and how are we addressing today? The question is, how are we addressing the threat from the Houthis attacking international shipping? There are some people who sort of say, look, this is a distraction from our problems in China and East Asia. I would say a lot of what our policy there is about protecting international shipping and the rights to freedom of navigation. That's directly under assault in the Red Sea from the Houthis. So I think there's a U.S. national interest to being involved there. But then we're also sending, 15 plus missiles at Houthi sites and infrastructure. Those are $1 million, sometimes $2 million weapons we're firing. The interceptors cost about $2 million when we're shooting down these drones. Those are expensive and those are limited. And so I think the way I always think about it is, yes, we have to be involved, but we have to end these wars quickly and decisively. The worst possible outcome is that you have wars that drag on and without positive direction. So I think the U.S. is going to experience this the next several years where we're going to see these conflicts emerge. And I think the answer needs to be, how do we win decisively and very quickly? And that means using overwhelming force at the outset so that these do not turn into a prolonged problem.
Yeah.
On Ukraine, go ahead.
That does get back to, I think, a very common sense notion that was lost after the period of major military operations ended with Operation Iraqi Freedom. There was initial shock and awe that was decisively effective. And then against everyone's better judgment, it went into nation building, and it just dragged and dragged and dragged. That was brutal experience. But getting back to the notion of, if America is going to be called in, it better be overwhelming. And that's the ultimate way to keep our people and our armed services safe.
Absolutely. And I feel really badly right now for our service members in the Middle East who've been sitting ducks for the last several months, but really actually much longer. There were, the first 2.5 years of the administration of this current administration, there have been over 80 attacks on our service members in Iraq and Syria, and we'd responded 4 times. Mm-hmm. It doesn't feel good when you're on the other end of ballistic missiles and drones coming at you, and you're not allowed to respond.
That's rough. Absolutely rough. Well, we also have a problem you mentioned earlier, too, of a southern border. And so how do we get the deterrence package right? And I don't speak just in armaments, but if we don't have a handle on our own borders, if we're fighting against a threat that is spreading on our own streets and in our own communities, if we have alliances that are doubting America in key parts of the world under current problems. I mean, if you look at the Afghanistan withdrawal to things dragging on in the Europe theater, NATO has some work to do to kind of recover credible deterrence. When you look at what's happened in the Middle East, I mean, it just seems like it's torn the very foundations under the maximum pressure campaign on Iran, where we had allies that were looking at an alternative path to peace and prosperity, and they could have normalized relations with Israel with across the Arab allies. I mean, just put us. We had things. Energy independence was within reach. We had options we could take on trade, on military, on readjusting and normalizing, rebalancing alliances, and just feels like all the legs under those stools have been kicked out from under at this point. So what do you see as kind of the key urgent steps to put those back in place one after the other?
Well, I think the border is not our last line of defense. Sorry, it's not our first line of defense. It's our last line of defense.
Yeah.
When we saw what happened in Afghanistan, that means that we're not addressing the terror situation over there. That means we now have 31 provinces where ISIS and Al Qaeda are now present. They're metastasizing, and we're not doing strikes there anymore. And so one thing that we've seen over 400 immigrants from Afghanistan cross the border, over 500 from Yemen and 600 from Syria, 600 from Iran. That's a problem that starts over there. And again, I actually think Israel is our first line of defense in a lot of these areas in the Middle East. They're an incredible counterterrorism partner. And so understanding that if we have these strong alliances, if we help NATO beat back the Russians, that prohibits a massive refugee crisis in Europe, which overflows into the United States ultimately. If we can work with countries and partners in the Middle East to stabilize those areas, that means we don't get massive flows of those people coming across. Same with Latin America. Venezuela, we saw over 5 million displaced people because of communism destroying that country's economy. And if we could, and that has destabilized Colombia, Brazil, it comes back up to the border. So part of this is, and I'm sure you understand this, is we think the rest of the world is sort of not our problem. It will ultimately always try to come back to our shores.
Yeah. Well, we've talked a lot about the classical parts of national security. Let's talk a little bit on the economic and trade front. I happen to think that is an incredibly important part of getting deterrence right, but also giving the right kinds of inducements to partners that are on our side. We talk a lot on this program and in other forums about a principle of reciprocity and moving toward more balanced economic relations. The example of the opposite is what the world did, led by the United States with the People's Republic of China. 30 years ago, we did not have overwhelming dependence upon one market, much less a market that would feed poisons out into the world to kill us and lie about it and engage in unfair trade, et cetera, et cetera. And we've transferred immense amounts of wealth from this unbalanced trade to that country that has very, very clearly turned that into investment, into national security capabilities that threaten our interests. You talked about all of those platforms going out, whether it's the naval comparisons or the Air Force comparisons. It's been a dramatic change, but it comes back essentially to an unbalanced economic relationship. So what do you think we could actually implement a policy that trends more toward reciprocity? What we aren't allowed to do in China, their entities should not be able to do in the United States. And we should work in ways so we don't have this massive imbalance and wealth transfer to an adversary.
One of the first things that Matt Pottinger did when he came in as Deputy National Security Advisor is he went down this huge checklist of things and said, okay, here's what China allows us to do, and here's what we allow China to do. Let's just balance this. Mm-hmm. And we saw the CCP, holler and scream at all these things and said, look, you can fix any of these things overnight. Just give the U.S. companies freedom to act like we had given those to Chinese companies. Allow our reporters to go report wherever they want. We're happy to have a free and open relationship if you agree to the common rules of the road. And so I think that was a really important rebalancing there. When it comes to the economic relationship, I always think about how can you increase U.S. leverage over that relationship. The Chinese have had leverage over us for a long time of thinking about, okay, we control the cheap labor, we control critical minerals. To me, the critical minerals one, if we think that OPEC had leverage over us in the 70s, we haven't seen anything coming. The Chinese have access to 85, 90% of the whole clean energy supply chain for solar panels, for electric vehicles. So first, we have to extract ourselves from these dependent relationships. And then think about, how do we put China in a bad situation where they are the ones dependent on us? Go on the offense. That's how you'll get China to be really wary about crossing us or invading Taiwan if they're afraid about what are their own economic vulnerabilities.
Well, there's a lot to work with on that front. I certainly hope that a lot of work is being done to give a new team, should one come in the next election cycle, or just in general for those who are practitioners in the U.S. government, to think much, much more in depth. Because I believe America has a lot more leverage, and we've left a lot of tools on the table without using them in past administrations. I know that there's a team of people, the America First Policy Institute, are working on trying to have a comprehensive set of plans and tools to do that. If you could put that thinking cap on for a moment, what do you think are some of the top tier tools that a new president ought to be aware of to kind of right the ship? Of course, we're the China desk, so we think of getting the U.S.-China relationship or getting the challenge of the CCP's malign influences under control as priority number one. But really, if you look at this new axis of evil of Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, you could put a few other places on there. What are some of the key ways a new president could hit the ground running and move this back in the right direction?
Absolutely. And AFPI has done such great work, not just on the Asia front, really across the whole national security spectrum, thinking about how do we get ready on day one. One thing I always look at is what gets the Chinese the most furious and the most anxious. And I've seen it in their technology companies.
Yeah.
When we've threatened to cut off access for semiconductors, for exports on things like their top security companies, that is when they come begging to Washington, and they fly to us rather than us flying to Beijing, and they figure out how can we put a stop to that. And I think instead of working that, is we need to go proactive, ban TikTok, I think, or at least make it forced over to U.S. ownership. Look at again, any technology that the Chinese government is relying on today. That means they are trying to replicate it and steal it immediately so that they do not have to be relying on us today. So I think cutting off all access almost overnight just to stop that process happening and slowing them down is going to make sense. They can then come into Washington and negotiate a more favorable deal in return. But it shouldn't be us sort of considering whether to do this. My view is stem the flow of damage that is coming out the door, and then we can negotiate a relationship of equals. That relationship of equals involves things like them cracking down actually on fentanyl. It means them actually not trying to infiltrate every element of American society. I think it is possible for us to get to a position where we can have peaceful coexistence like they talk about a lot. Yeah. But they do not want peaceful coexistence. They want subservience in the United States. And we have to get to an actual, real peaceful coexistence, we have to approach them from a position of strength and force them into that relationship of equals.
Well, it's going to be a tall task, but I've greatly appreciated your contribution to the conversation today with us. Before we zoom out, where can the audience track your commentary, your research? Where should they go to keep up with your analysis?
Well, I tweet way too much, or I guess post on X. So if you're there, I'm at GL Noronha. That's GLNORONHA. Talk a lot about Iran, talk a lot about the Middle East, talk a lot about China there. And you can find out more about Polaris at polaris-us.org.
Well, I encourage everyone to go there and follow, subscribe, do what you can do to continue this conversation with Gabriel. If you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on our YouTube channel or on your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for joining, and thank you, Gabriel Noronha, for sharing your perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.